Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. Hello and welcome again. My guest this week is Tania Blanchard, author of The Girl from Munich, which was published by Simon & Schuster late last year. Welcome, Tania.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, this is your debut novel, and I must congratulate you on a wonderful book. I absolutely loved it.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did indeed. For the benefit of listeners who haven't already had the privilege of reading it, could you tell me a little bit about your book?
Sure. The Girl from Munich's basically a coming-of-age story set in World War II in Germany. It's a story about Lottie, a young 18-year-old girl who comes from a privileged background. She wants to be a photographer on the front, and her parents obviously don't let her go, and she ends up working for the Luftwaffe as a secretary. She's engaged to be married to her childhood sweetheart. She comes from this privileged background. And it's there that she learns, while working for the Luftwaffe, that everything isn't as she has believed it to be or as it seems. She's grown up being indoctrinated by Nazi policy and Nazi teachings, and she believes Germany is winning the war. So as the war progresses, she learns that all is not as it seems, and Germany, in fact, isn't winning the war. And she begins to learn that everything she's been taught to believe isn't true. So through towards the end of the war, she has to flee Munich, where she's been working and living with her boss, Erich Drescher. Her fiancé, Heinrich, is away on the Eastern Front. She doesn't know what's happened to him, and they escape Munich as the Allies come into Munich. And then she realises that she now has the opportunity, through all the experiences that she's had during the wartime, to live the life that she wants to lead. And it's time for her to choose what her life is going to be.
Yes, well, it was a fascinating insight into that period of history. So I guess for me, the question was, where did you get the idea to write this novel?
Well, the story is basically inspired by my own grandmother's stories. So I grew up listening to lots of stories that she would tell about her life during the war and what had happened to her. And especially I remember the story of her telling me running away with her boss from Munich and travelling through the countryside, sleeping under bushes in the open air in the forests to try and get to her aunt's house in the countryside where her mother was waiting for her. So this really inspired my imagination, and I've always wanted to write my grandmother's story, and so eventually I had the opportunity to do so.
Well, that was marvellous. So obviously the character of Lottie is based on a real life person. So it was based on your grandmother.
That's right.
That's fascinating to me. Did you find that it was difficult to fictionalise her life?
Well, it wasn't too hard, actually. I had sort of basic cornerstones of what she had told me had happened to her during her life. The other things that I used was photos and documents that she'd left behind to give me a little bit more insight into what life might have been like for her. As far as fictionalising the rest, of course, I did that because there were lots of blank spaces in between. But she was such a larger-than-life person to me anyway, and I'd known her all my life, and she died when she was 91. So I spent many years with her and got to know her so very well that it was actually quite easy to write her character and fictionalise those parts that I didn't know what actually happened, because she was so larger than life for me anyway.
Amazing. And you mentioned that, she'd left behind lots of evidence of her life during the war. So I wanted to ask you, what other research did you do?
Yeah. So, as I say, there was photos, documents, letters that she left behind, and they were good starting points to research further and learn more about what Nazi Germany had been like prior to the war, and also what things were like during the war. I learned a bit more about her family and where they had been. Like her brother was fighting on the Eastern Front, so that gave me sort of insight into research further. The other things I used was lots of documentaries, lots of first-hand accounts, and lots of just internet research as well.
Yeah. Well, it definitely does come through. I mean, the detail is magnificent in the book, without being overbearing, I think. It sort of really gave you and me as the reader an insight into what life was like then. So I think you've done a marvellous job there. And so then I wondered, well, did you actually travel to Germany?
Well, actually, I haven't travelled recently to Germany. I went when I was quite young with my family and saw where my mother had grown up and so where my grandmother had lived. So I saw Munich at that time as well. So unfortunately, I couldn't go more recently, but I was able to draw from those memories and talking to my mother about where she'd grown up as well. And thank God we have the internet. I mean, Google is the most wonderful thing.
Isn't
So
it just?
yeah. I was able to extrapolate from all of those sources and put a plausible image of what Munich had been like at that time.
Fantastic. And I know that we've obviously talked about the fact that it does have a unique perspective because we are learning about the war from a German civilian perspective.
Yeah.
Did you think that presented any particular difficulties for you as you were writing it?
Look, I was mindful that this can still be quite a sensitive topic for many people. World War II was really only finished just over 70 years ago, and it's still in living memory for a lot of people. And if not that first generation, certainly the next generation down. So there were lots of individuals and families that really suffered during that time on all sides of the war. So that was something I wanted to be really mindful of as I wrote this story from the perspective of an ordinary German girl.
Yes, indeed. I think you've done it beautifully there.
Thank you.
Did you think, I mean, it is such a huge topic, World War II, and, people are still writing about it. Did
Yep.
you think at any time that this story might get lost in the crowd?
Yeah, look, I wasn't too concerned about that because the majority of the stories that have been coming out up until this time have been from the perspective of the Allies. So there aren't a lot of stories coming out from the perspective of the German people, and not even the soldiers on the front, but the actual citizens that were on the home front. And that's why I thought that this perspective was a great one to pursue and research further, because I thought that was quite a new and different way to look at the war from the eyes of a young girl on the home front.
In Australia, the popularity of historical fiction runs second only to crime or thriller fiction. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that there's a growing awareness about our past and where we've come from. I mean, you can look at things like the growing popularity of researching family history. That sort of indicates that there is this growing awareness of where we've come from in our past. I think here in Australia, we've certainly got that real diverse cultural background, and there are lots of stories emerging about families and stories that give us a sense of identity. And I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is historical fiction transports us back to a different time and place. And gives us the human stories around monumental moments in history. And I suppose, war is always part of that. I think people have a fascination to learn how others at that time responded to the events that went on around them, how they fit into the social fabric or rebelled against it, and what kind of factors shaped their lives. Because despite all of that, I think we have discovered that no matter where people lived or when, that our basic human stories remain the same. So I think with historical fiction, it can inspire us with the qualities of people at that time. There was strength and courage, determination, perseverance of really ordinary people in times of adversity. And I think that's what we find fascinating.
In terms of the mass appeal of historical fiction, I don't see that sort of abating anytime soon. Was that a motivating factor in your writing? Was it, was it something that you consciously thought, well, I'm going to write historical fiction?
No, it wasn't actually. History is something I've always been quite passionate about. And I've always loved family stories growing up, listening to them. So it's always something that I've wanted to write about, actually. And I'm just very fortunate that that it's something that people want to read.
Fantastic. If you had to liken your work to any other writers in the historical fiction genre, who would you choose?
That's a really difficult question, actually.
Yeah.
I find that I don't read a lot while I'm writing. So when I'm finished writing a story, then I'll get out and do some wide reading. And recently I read The Liberation by Kate Furnivall, and I really connected with the way she told the story. So it's set post-World War II in Italy.
Yeah.
But I really connected with the way she told the story and the really strong female protagonist. So I guess I feel a bit of a connection to her writing. So perhaps that could mean that we're maybe similar style.
So amidst the grief, the loss and the destruction you detail in the book, at its heart is a really compelling love story. And without giving too much of the book away, did you believe Lottie gave up too much of herself for love? Or was she just a product of her time?
Look, I think she was definitely a product of her time. If you think about what young people went through during that time, they were a product of Hitler's indoctrination. They were a product of propaganda. She came from a privileged background where there were certain expectations and traditions that she was expected to follow through with. And I think through the process of war, she was given the opportunity to find out who she truly was, as were a lot of women at that time. They were the ones that were left on the home front. They had to continue on with the home, looking after the family, providing work, helping the country run, providing materials and food for the war effort. So they were the strong ones left in the background. But through that, I think women really found a sense of themselves. And once the war was over, it was a different generation of women out there. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to make decisions and choices for themselves. They wanted to make their mark on the world. And I think that's exactly what Lottie does by the end of the story.
Tania, you're working on a sequel now, and I understand it picks up from where the girl from Munich leaves off.
Yes, that's right. The story basically follows Lottie when she and her family migrate to Australia in 1956. They leave the chaos of post-war Europe behind them, and they hope to build a better future for the family here in Australia. However, they find that life in Australia isn't what they expected, and being new Australians has its own set of challenges. They struggle to find their feet and their place in this new country, and Lottie comes to understand that you can never truly leave your past behind. But she has a sense of what home truly means to her by the end of the story.
Sure. So does it still also draw on your family's history?
Yes, it absolutely does. My grandparents did migrate to Australia in 1956. So it basically does follow their story here and you know, what they went through when they came here to Australia and started a new life.
Fantastic, as so many people did in that period of time.
Yeah.
So when can we expect to see this book in bookstores?
November.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, just finishing off the final edits now, and it goes to print soon and then in the bookstores by November.
Brilliant, brilliant. Just in time for Christmas.
Yeah.
So, Tania, tell me about the Arbias. The girl from Munich was shortlisted for this year's Arbias Awards, and from what I understand, there were 5 debut authors on the shortlist. What do you think this says about the Australian literary landscape at the moment?
Look, I think it says wonderful things about Australian authors and about the Australian literary scene. I think it's alive and well. Australian authors are really well supported by the publishing industry and by the Australian public as well. I think debut authors are certainly getting promoted and being supported, and there's lots and lots of stories out there that need to be told, Australian stories. And I think people are ready to tell them and ready to hear them. And certainly the ABIAs show that the support is there for these stories.
I absolutely do. So, Tania, if listeners wanted to connect with you or to learn more about your books, where can they find you?
I do have a website, so that's www.taniablanchard.com.au, and I also have an author Facebook page, which is Tania Blanchard Author.
Brilliant, brilliant. Tania, I wanted to congratulate you once more on a brilliant start to what I'm sure will be a long career as a novelist. It's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Claudine, for having me. My pleasure.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.